I was in the upstairs hallway pulling on my good earrings when Marta grabbed my wrist. Not touched my arm, grabbed it, the way you grab someone who's about to step off a curb without looking. I turned around and she was already shaking her head, eyes wide, finger pressed to her lips. Marta has worked in my house for 19 years. She has never once raised her voice. She has never come upstairs without being asked. And she had never, not once in all those years, looked at me the way she was looking at me right then. She pointed down the hallway toward the guest room. My daughter was in there. My daughter and her fiancé, who had arrived 2 days earlier from Calgary to help us celebrate my youngest grandson's graduation dinner. The whole family was downstairs getting ready. I could hear my son calling up, asking if anyone had seen his jacket. Marta leaned close to my ear. "Do not go in there," she whispered, "and please, don't let them know you're here." I almost laughed. I almost said, "Marta, what on earth are you talking about?" But her hand was still on my wrist and her face was completely serious. I have known this woman through the death of my husband, through a cancer scare, through the flood that destroyed our basement in 2018. She does not frighten easily. I stood very still. The door was not latched. It never latches properly. We've been meaning to fix it for years. And through that narrow gap, I heard my daughter's voice. I heard everything. My daughter's name is Sylvie. She is 41 years old. She was born on a Wednesday morning in October, and I remember exactly what the light looked like coming through the hospital window. I have loved her the way you love someone who came from inside your own body, the way that has no logic to it and doesn't need any. She was talking about me. She was talking about me the way you talk about a problem, a logistical obstacle, something to be managed until it becomes irrelevant. Her fiancé, I'll call him what he was talking too. I had never trusted him, not in the way you trust someone you truly believe means well for your child. He was pleasant enough, always pleasant, the kind of pleasant that covers something else. I used to tell myself I was being unfair. I was not being unfair. What I heard him say was this, that it had to happen before the spring, that once the transfer went through, the wording of my original will was no longer going to protect what I thought it was protecting. He said it the way someone says it who has read the documents, who has read them more than once. And my daughter said, "She trusts me completely. That's not going to be a problem." I stopped breathing. I want to be very clear about what that sentence did to me. It wasn't anger, not first. It was something physical, like the floor had dropped away, like I was standing on nothing. I had trusted her completely. That was true. I had named her as executor of my estate. I had given her signing authority over the family trust when my husband died, because she was the organized one, the careful one, the one who always came to the meetings and asked the right questions. My son is a good man, but he's never been interested in paperwork. That was always Sylvie. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Marta was beside me. She had let go of my wrist by then. We didn't look at each other. We just listened. They talked about timing, about the cottage in the Gatineau, whether it made more sense to sell it before or after a certain point, about something he called the amendment, which I did not understand then, but came to understand very clearly later, about how my son wasn't a concern because he had no idea what was in the trust documents. At one point, Sylvie said, "I just need a few more weeks." She's being completely reasonable about everything. Reasonable? I had thought we were just getting along well. I had thought the last few months had been some kind of turning point for us. They weren't. Eventually, they came downstairs. I came downstairs too, a few minutes later, through the back staircase. Marta brought me a glass of water in the kitchen and stood across from me, and I could see she'd been holding this for a while. I could see it had been eating at her. "How long have you known?" I asked. She said she'd heard pieces of it before. A phone call a few months ago. A conversation the last time they visited. She said she hadn't been sure enough to say anything. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. We went to the graduation dinner. I sat across from my daughter and I watched her pour wine for everyone and tell a story that made the table laugh and put her hand on my arm twice and say, "Mom, you look wonderful tonight." And I smiled. I smiled through the whole thing. That was one of the harder nights of my life. Not because I was heartbroken, though I was, but because I had to make a decision about how to handle what I knew, and I had to make it while passing the bread and listening to my grandson talk about his plans for university. I had to make it without letting anything show. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name is Wendell, and he has been my family solicitor for 22 years, and he picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed to come in. I told him it was urgent, and I asked him not to mention it to anyone else in the office for the time being. He asked no questions. That's the thing about people who have known you for a long time. They hear the weight in your voice and they respond to it without requiring an explanation first. I went in on the Thursday. I brought my original will, the trust documents, and the folder of financial records I keep in the back of the cabinet in my office. Wendell read everything I brought and asked me some questions I had not expected and showed me 3 things in the documents that I had not noticed before. He was careful with his language. He said things like, "This could potentially allow for," and "depending on interpretation," but what he was telling me was that my daughter, as executor, had access to mechanisms that would not require my active participation, that there were things she could do within the letter of what I'd signed that I had not intended when I signed them. I asked him how long it would take to fix. He said, "That depends on what you want it to look like when we're done." We spent 4 hours in that office. By the end of it, I had a revised trust structure, a new executor named my son, who cried a little when I called him that evening, which I had not expected from a 53-year-old man, and a very clear picture of what had nearly happened. The cottage stayed. That was one thing I was firm about. My husband built that cottage with his own hands, or mostly his own hands. We bought the land in 1987, and he spent 3 summers framing it out on weekends. My daughter was not getting that cottage. Not under any circumstances. I also made a change that I had not planned to make when I walked into Wendell's office, but that felt completely obvious by the time I left. I added Marta to my will. Not a token amount, a real one. Enough to matter. Enough to acknowledge what 19 years of loyalty actually looks like when you put it next to blood that turned out to mean something different than you thought. I did not confront my daughter right away. I want to explain that because some people, when I've told parts of this story, have said they wouldn't have waited, and I understand that. But I had spent 41 years raising this woman, and I did not want to do it in anger. I wanted to do it clearly. I waited 2 weeks. She came back to Ottawa for a long weekend at the end of the month. She was supposed to be helping me go through some boxes in the storage room, which in retrospect tells you something about the level of access she had made herself comfortable with. And we sat down at the kitchen table after lunch. I told her what I had heard. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, at least not until later. I just told her I was in the hallway. Marta was with me. We heard the conversation you had with him in the guest room the night of the graduation dinner. She went very white. She started to say something and then stopped. She tried a different thing and stopped again. She looked at the table for a long time. Then she said, "How much did you hear?" I said, "Enough to call Wendell the next morning." That landed. I could see it land. She knew what it meant, that whatever she had been planning had already been undone, that I had not sat on what I knew and given her more time to act on it. And here is the thing I was not prepared for, the thing I still think about. She started crying, not the kind of crying that's meant to get you something, the kind that happens when something breaks open. She put her hands over her face and she cried. And I sat across from her and I didn't move toward her and I didn't move away from her. And eventually she looked up and she said, "I don't know when I became someone who would do this to you." That sentence, that one sentence, I have turned it over many times in the months since. I think it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in a long time, maybe longer than I want to know. She told me the whole thing then, how it had started, How he had first brought it up as a kind of theoretical conversation about protecting assets, and she had not seen it clearly for what it was. How it had shifted, gradually, until she was participating in something she hadn't consciously signed up for, or that was what she told herself. I don't know how much of that was true and how much was what you tell yourself after you've been caught. I may never know. What I do know is that the relationship between my daughter and that man ended within 6 weeks of that conversation. She ended it herself. I did not ask her to. I didn't say a word about him after the day she told me everything because it wasn't my decision to make. But she ended it, and she came back to me in pieces, the way someone comes back when they've looked at themselves clearly and didn't like what they found. It has been almost a year now. We are in a different place. Not where we were before, because you don't go back to before once you know what you know, but somewhere. A place where she calls me more than she used to and says things she actually means, and where I can look at her across a table without that hollow feeling I had for those first months. I took her to the cottage in July, just the two of us for 4 days. We didn't talk about what happened the whole time we were there. We swam. We made coffee in the mornings and sat on the dock. One afternoon there was a thunderstorm and we sat inside and played cribbage the way we hadn't done since she was a teenager. On the last evening, I told her about Marta, about what I'd changed in the documents. I told her not because I wanted her to feel bad about it, but because Marta deserved to be acknowledged out loud. Sylvie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "She's always been better to you than I have." I said, "She's been different. You're my daughter." That doesn't excuse anything. No, I said, it doesn't, but it means something anyway. I don't know if I fully believe that. I'm still working it out. I think that's honest. What I do believe, very clearly, is that loyalty is not guaranteed by closeness. It is not a function of how long you've known someone or how much of yourself you've given them. Some of the most loyal people in your life will be the ones who never had any obligation to be, who stayed because they chose to every single day for 19 years without ever asking for anything in return. Marta knows what I changed in the documents. I told her myself, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in October. She looked at me for a long moment and then she looked away and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know I didn't have to." She made us both tea and we didn't say anything else about it. That is also a thing I love about her. The way she knows when a thing has been said and doesn't need to be said again. My grandson graduated with honors. He is going into environmental science at the University of Guelph in September. He has no idea what happened the night of his graduation dinner, and I intend to keep it that way for a long time, possibly forever. That evening was his. The mess of it was mine, and I am the one who had to carry it. And in some ways, I am grateful I was the one who got to. The earrings are still on my dresser. I put them on for the first time last month, for a friend's birthday dinner. They're just pearl studs, nothing remarkable. But for a few months, I couldn't look at them without feeling the way I felt in that hallway. I'm past that now, mostly. If you had asked me 2 years ago whether my daughter was capable of what she was planning, I would have said no, not Sylvie. And I think that certainty, that absolute trust, was part of why it nearly worked. I don't say that to warn you away from trusting the people you love. You have to trust the people you love. That's not negotiable. But I think now that trust is not a thing you give once and walk away from. It is something you stay present with, something you keep your eyes open inside of. And when someone who has no reason to do so, no stake in it, no angle, nothing to gain, pulls you into a hallway and tells you to listen, you listen. I am very glad I listened. I thought a lot about what it actually takes to do the right thing when the right thing costs you something. Marta could have stayed quiet. She had no legal obligation to tell me anything. She had no financial stake in what happened either way. What she had was 19 years of watching our family, of knowing what was true and what wasn't, and the kind of character that doesn't let you walk past something wrong just because walking past it would be easier. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very rare thing, and I don't think I understood how rare until I was standing in that hallway beside her. What she did took honesty, not the easy kind, not correcting a wrong order at a restaurant or returning extra change, the kind that puts you in an uncomfortable position with people who have power over your life. She worked in my home. My daughter could have made things very difficult for her. And she told me anyway because she believed I deserved to know. That kind of moral clarity, the willingness to do what's right even when there's real risk attached to it, is something most of us say we have, but very few of us actually demonstrate when it counts. And then there's what I had to do with what she told me. I want to be honest about this part. It would have been very easy to fall apart, to spend weeks grieving privately and not act until it was too late. Instead, I called Wendell the next morning. I went through the documents. I asked the hard questions. I made decisions while I was still in shock from what I'd learned because I understood, clearly, in a way I hadn't before. That clarity doesn't wait for you to feel ready. That's the part I'm most grateful for, looking back. Not that I was angry enough to act, but that I was clear-headed enough to act well, to think through what I actually wanted to protect and why, instead of just reacting, to name my son as executor, not out of spite, but because it was the right structural decision, to add Marta to my will, not as a gesture, but as a genuine recognition of what she'd given me over 19 years. Good judgment under pressure. That's not something you're born with. It's something you build by paying attention to your own life and being honest about what you see. And Sylvie, my daughter, the part of this story I still don't know exactly how to hold. I think about the person she was becoming in that relationship and the person she came back to being after it ended. I think about what it takes to look at yourself clearly after you've done something that betrayed your own values. Not just someone else's trust, but your own sense of who you are. That's a hard thing. A lot of people don't do it. They find reasons and explanations, and they build a story around those reasons until the story is more comfortable than the truth. She didn't do that. She sat at my kitchen table and she said she didn't know when she'd become someone capable of this. That sentence took courage. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that just stays in the room with what's true instead of trying to make it smaller. I'm not sure where we go from here. I'm not sure you ever fully go back, but I think you can go forward if both people are willing to be honest about what happened and what it cost, and willing to keep showing up anyway. That's what I'm trying to do. The cottage is still ours. Marta knows she's in the will. My son cried on the phone and then pulled himself together and said he'd take the responsibility seriously. And on a Tuesday morning in October, Marta and I had tea in the kitchen and didn't need to say much else. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough.